Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval historiography in contemporary times, the Romantic Middle Ages, the so-called Germanic model, and the German roots in these interpretations regarding the origins of Europe and the Latin-Germanic meeting, fundamentally. It's a lot of stuff all at a time. I just picked this topic randomly out of my magical Schwerpunkt cycle, but let's say it fits well with some videos we've made in the last months, and I would say even better with the last video, that commentary that I made on Metatron's views on the theories about the Nordicism of the ancient Romans. And as you understand, the topic is controversial in itself. I'm actually planning to make two videos, among the others, on traditional history about the sort of aspect, right? The look and sort of self-portrayal of early Romans, or ancient Romans, right, sticking to the Romano-Italic dimension, but also one on the role of the Germans as a people regarding the Renovatio Imperii. It's definitely not the first time. This is what I say basically all the time in this video, on this channel now that has over 1900 videos, but it's not anecdotal because I've already spoken my mind on these topics more than once, right? But there is one component that is important to get straight, and that today we can just introduce fundamentally, that is the formation and development of the historiographical concepts of these ideas. So we will talk about medievalism. If you're interested in that specifically, I remember years ago I made a video titled The Reconstructed Middle Ages. Then I don't think I've made much about Romanticism just per se, but let's say about Germanism and the sort of I have an entire playlist actually on Latin-Germanic Europe, also explaining conceptually why this concept is so important historiographically and historically, just per se. Today we'll look at this without too many ideological premises, because usually whenever you touch these topics, the idea is be where that this and that is believed, etc. Here the topic will actually eviscerate itself by itself, because we will list more or less say the major controversies regarding how the Middle Ages was seen in relation to Rome and the Germanic peoples, and of course referring to essentially 19th century Western historiography, that since of course the West was at the peak of its world power, has a very deep meaning and a much more concrete one when observed in the wake of imperial tradition. Right, whenever you study these topics, normally the idea is, okay, we will list now some scholars, some historiographers that essentially created the concept of the Middle Ages, the reconstructed Middle Ages, the Viollet-le-Duc, the post-Raphael, pre-Raphaelite, etc. The sense of, say, that view of the Middle Ages that, if you want, even as from our generations we've known through Disney movies as children, and that we sort of believed it, that was ingrained in us, and that from one side has been described to us, at least by some figures. It can be anyone, but very often educators, and at some point sane historians, being fundamentally incorrect for some reason. We'll explain it now. You know that I am, of course, to say the least, a conservative channel. I'm openly a right-wing, and not necessarily in the way people think this, like it's much more right-wing than you think, actually. But it's the type of right-wing, in fact, that is not really known anymore, right? Because it's even incorrect to pose the question of left and right in this regard. It's more about tradition, right? And it's something that I have been rediscovering in my life in the last years to a degree that has really, say, influenced me. But on top of, as you know, a doctoral, curriculum. So I think I've been privileged because certain things in my life came, even the negative ones, in a sense, in the right time for me to sort of elaborate on them with specific tools that I hope I can highlight during the same, this videos in general, my exposition. So we'll talk about lots of things at a time now. Try to follow me if you can, because it's going to be quite a ride. All right. So we made videos about humanism and the Renaissance, right? And we're essentially told that the concept of Middle Ages historiographically, so since its formulation in this essentially late medieval context, ironically enough, for those who at least were especially giving a negative exception to an era that today we include that in, had immediately a sort of negative connotation. Now, there is no doubt, as just said, that of course the Middle Ages were at some point conceptualized with this sort of, just as the term says, right, an era that didn't even deserve a sort of qualifying characteristic on its own, if not having been in between some others, right? We will see better which ones these were. Very often we're told that, especially compared to antiquity, we're talking about the classics, so a sort of, let's say, equally crystallized sense of what antiquity was, and not in what, in my opinion, was actually the meaning of the humanists, and that we have also explained not being that much biased, actually, in even on average, against the Middle Ages, right? At least we've been told, as we've been provided with this narrative that yes, somebody fundamentally in the Italy of Lorenzo il Magnifico began to say, well, everything good was Roman, and so what happened up to now in this sort of Middle Age was negative, it was polluted with something else. As a matter of fact, it was not, it's something deterior, right? This is not entirely what they meant by that, right? This is a long, I'm obliged to make digressions here, but it's like when you, and I made lots of videos about late antiquity, migration era, the concepts of Byzantine, like those videos explain these things, my point on them. That, like we are told from sort of unqualified background that the Middle Ages, in fact, were a dark age, right? And that the Byzantines were decadent, and they were not real Romans, and all this stuff. And when we are in our early 20s, let's say we go to university and we start learning this thing, we all fall in love with the idea, oh no, we have to correct, right? That's the moment in which you still have to affirm yourself as a mature human being, a fully developed adult. And so you're essentially trying to go against all the things that you've been told as a sort of criticism and say, this is not true. The Middle Ages were splendid, and the Byzantines were true Romans. And whoever says anything against that, it's not just wrong, but it's hopelessly thinking that, yes, the Middle Ages were just a bad thing, or that the Byzantines were not Romans for some other reason. And not really actually getting to the point that, of course, I think by your mid-20s, late 20s, you must have gotten to, especially if you've gone on with your historical insight, that is, okay, I manned up a little. And so, even though I perfectly know that, as I often say myself, of course, on a channel dedicated mostly to the Middle Ages, so evidently I can't be that, say, making all this work on something that I hate, because I would have not studied that for so many years as a living. But there is something to the Middle Ages that we must start seeing also through the actual lens of the people that were writing about it at the time, in ways that we actually simplified by saying, these humanists just hated this medieval gods, right? And they really just liked anything classical, and I think it's much more nuanced, right? And especially the concept that, of course, after the Roman Empire, something had contracted at best, and that had fundamentally, we were talking about it yesterday, just about in the video about the other day about medieval demographics, etc. We know essentially what civilization did in those centuries, right? It contracted at the very beginning of the Middle Ages. A very common misconception is that the Middle Ages were sort of stagnating or down-going period. Absolutely not, right? But you cannot, they were essentially a moment of almost continuous growth, and a hell of a growth that also surpassed, for sure, the ancient world. But indeed, right at the beginning, right, you are starting from a depressed situation compared to before. Things were much harder. Something had happened, right? That is not just saying, I don't know, the average person has their own more favorite things. It was Christianity, or it was the barbarians, or it was the corrupted Romans, and all this stuff, right? And you know that this channel is not based on these ideas that in fact are simplistic, manufactorial, superficial, shallow, and so on, but there is something to the historical objectivity of them that must be taken seriously, very seriously into consideration, right? We live today, especially in the world of information or misinformation or uninformation, in a sort of hysterical extreme, right, dichotomy in which people say, no, absolutely, you could not say that the Middle Ages were such a backward time, because you're an idiot and a bigot and whatever. And then you have the allegedly most enlightened, I don't know, journalists, which is actually a category that on average, I dislike even my fellow historian colleagues, but, I consider, journalists like some historians going wrong, right? The dumb cousin from the depressed background that say terrible things, like use this still terms like this is a Byzantinistic thing, or it's we're going back to medieval times in a contented acception, and pretending that there was this terrible time that we fortunately got out from with our great principles that we can definitely see under our eyes socially nowadays. What kind of a great recipe that was, and without, of course, any further nuance, any further criticism or whatever. So one way the Italian humanists that were, as you know, the leaders in this field, like in the Renaissance in the first place, but in this essentially creation of the medieval concept that was eventually embraced by others, and just what we go by still today, in the West had always sort of been the case, even as we will see now during the 19th century. At least there were some extremes in their polarization due to, I don't like the term polar, but as we will see now, there is really some sort of schizophrenic attitude, culturally speaking. And yes, the 19th and 20th century were a pretty bad mess, to say the least. But going by order, the thing that really one should focus on, the humanistic revisitation of ancient virtue, is actually the true traditional one, right? In all the great phases of what we are told like being the peak of civilization in a way, I don't know, classical Greece, especially in terms of art, of science, etc., Renaissance Italy, etc., you can see this dichotomy. From one side, you have an undebatable development, an undebatable sort of wealth of knowledge and minds and geniuses and so on. At the same time, a process of decline, right, based on contemplation, on rationalism, on secularism, on certain ideas that fundamentally sort of, it's the disease of abundance in many ways, right? It is struck at different levels in different times and places in history, brings people to relax, right, and to pretend that, after all, what also was being told by the top figures at the time was, after all, banal, shallow, and say, these guys, after all, declined later, and so we can't take them seriously, or whatever. There is always a double thread here. Civilization does strange things in terms of prosperity, in times of crisis, but what we call reason, right, in a virtue sense, is hardly quite the simple idea that these Renaissance scholars were merely wanting to find a rationalistic explanation to anything, and that we're simply looking at the rationalistic or secularistic aspect of the ancient world. I made a video, I don't remember how it's titled now, but it was like a couple of months ago, about the traditional meaning of the Renaissance. Yes, now I remembered it, which addresses what fundamentally the same Renaissance principles really were, right? And they were essentially inspired to a philological. Of course, there was not an homogeneity, even of course in the way scholars across Europe thought of the Renaissance and so on, what they took from it or not. Renaissance in itself is also a pretty broad term, and again, I made lots of videos about Cristella, about it. We will come back at some point on them as well. But essentially, what these people were doing were recovering tools that had been used by ancients, and also just in a documentary, scientific way, to explain, after all, things like they were pretty traditional in value. History, first and foremost. The traditional meaning of virtue contained within, say, the Roman sagas, right? This is a concept which has been sort of removed from us, and it was instead truly alive at the time, but also far beyond, right? Even if you look at classicism, until, look at all the classical models throughout the early modern age, say until Louis XVIII, until the French Revolution, in some cases even beyond, and realize that the entire, because the French Revolution hijacked classicism, but even in that, right, paradoxically, there was some of the traditional principle. That what the aristocracy fundamentally believed, and so in a world dominated by it, essentially permeating the entire system, the very values of command, of empire, of military discipline and virtue at the same time, essentially the concept that the better humans are the closest ones to God, right, and the Apollonian principle, and the capacity to lead and to the masses and transfiguring them, right, by making them attain victory. This was essentially, like, look at the entire, again, whichever Renaissance palace, wherever, go to Versailles, to any 18th century, even of the small European princes' palaces, whatever, and look at what symbolism actually was. Like, classicism, especially in the 18th century, wasn't like something that had not existed before, right, or that had not existed in the same Middle Ages. When you look at even at the heart of the Middle Ages before the humanists, the models were obviously classical. I mean, which other ones can you have? In the moment in which you are reviving them, and you had other peoples who were fundamentally not literate, and so that didn't quite leave a consistent trace of their ideas and beliefs and systems. The question is, and of course there had been an empire that had dominated essentially the world entire, and that had, of course, heavily drawn, and was heavily based in the first place on the same imperial, transcendental, virile, traditional Uranian concept, right? You understand, the entire absolutism was based on that. The entire ancien regime was based on that. But even before that, all the militia, the knighthood, and going back in time, the same allegedly democratic or republican Greek and Roman regimes that were basically all about that. And before that, the very origins of those peoples, Indo-Europeans, etc., were fundamentally based on the sole identical concept, right? The idea that we have been told, post revolutionary times, that the Renaissance, humanism, was a mere obsession with classical aesthetics, balance, rationalization, has actually nothing to do with what those people knew concretely at the time regarding the actual traditional meaning of the same. So when you look at these intellectuals that, of course, were peculiar in their own regard. I mean, traditional mentality was obviously much clearer to a 13th century knight than a 15th century intellectual, right? You can I study actually the very passage in this historically and historiographically. You know, the mid 14th century crisis was a moment of utter major shattering. That, as the same traditional meanings, say beliefs said, you know, the world ages and declines and rots and crumbles, and so the same awareness of the sacred in the heart of man declines. Look at the Reformation, and before that the decline of universal power. So there is all a decay that is important to frame accurately in this regard, because it's not that we simply declined in say in a material term, like that accomplishment would have been recognized by the same ancients as a great divine reward, because there is no other belief actually behind these values, but in a much more titanic and so unwise and unregulated and undisciplined way, right? So what the humanists were looking at in terms of, say, reason, which was mostly a term thrown around mostly in the Enlightenment, otherwise, is in fact us, right, heavily biased and influenced by mass society and the Enlightenment, the fourth estate taking over, that we cannot recognize, of course, in the meaning of even a late medieval scholar. It naturally was much more distant in practical terms from, say, well, I don't know, a warband chieftain of the 6th century, right, migrating through Europe could be, but that was at least starting actually to recover what we actually can document from the same classical literature about those beliefs that were at the center of that same patrimonium, right? Of course, if you study Pythagoras, of course, that's a guy that was completely in the opposite direction of that. There were communists in the ancient world. There were anti-traditionalists. There were always the telluric, materialistic, deterministic, feministic, relativistic systems. But tradition itself said these had to exist because the purpose of those who were at the top, and the very opposite of it, was to defeat them and transfigure them and to elevate the entire world back again to divine standard. And if you look at, I don't know, Italian painting, in that other video we exemplified it with a beautiful Botticelli's selection. You can't unsee what the anthropic models of the Renaissance humanists actually were. And there is hardly an anti-traditional picture there. And if you know that specific art, you know specifically what I'm talking about from a strictly biological point of view. And we'll come back on this hopefully in some other video. Naturally, there were contingent reasons for which, of course, Rome was resumed, but it's not true to say that Rome was, even though, of course, the age of nationalism had sort of began to some degree. Of course, full nationalism is probably just the one that emerges in the 19th century, and so there is a way of thinking nation, but not quite being the same. I think the Italian Renaissance is the best example, because while there is no doubt that the sort of balance of power in Italy before the Italian wars, the foreign invasions and dominations, etc., was actually inspired to a sort of unifying great unifying dreams of the Italian peninsula, right? Going back to the Augustan model, the myth of ancient Rome, and the fact that, of course, an Italian identity had been existing, and this also can't quite be denied. You're not a 19th century nationalist if you say, well, there was something like, I don't know, French or German, etc. Yes, they coexisted as identities, or they emerged from sort of more patched and complex dynamics, but they were already coming to be. They had already come to be, right? Personally, just to connect myself to what I was saying before, like, again, something you do early on is saying, oh, but nation is an invention, right? It does not exist. We're not all we're not all alike. That's in a sense correct, but it's an extreme, right? You cannot deny over time that there is a striking millennia-old continuity for essentially most regional, say, pools, right? We have seen it very often on Schwerpunkt for especially all of Europe, but you can easily talk about this for essentially many regional dimensions all over the world. There is so an inclination towards the Italianity from the same scholars. Think about, I don't know, the effort creating an Italian league, all the diplomatic work of say those who wanted this to maintain a balance, not to have a single guy emerging and even uniting against the Turks or the foreigners who were starting to be called like the barbarians, as if these guys had been literally in the first centuries BC. The same can be true in terms of political philosophy and institutions. Speaking of the Hellenic polis, right? Those actors that were committed in the perspective of civic autonomies would naturally look at, I don't know, Pericles' Athens, right, and say, well, that's something because, right, but this is also very approximate. It's not a monolithic or canonic approach. Different scholars in the Renaissance thought extremely different things that were, in fact, all one with something much more innovative and loaded and properly medieval in a positive sense, right? The Renaissance is not a product of antiquity. The Renaissance is a product of the Middle Ages, whichever that was, right? There is no doubt even here that there is a continuity, but because there were universal values that were seen in what we call antiquity, and that people in the Middle Ages had been aware of having, changed because of essentially a very heavy blow that had brought humanity to adopt even a certain type of spirituality, to reflect on its sins, to understand why the great universal empire had failed, and so what possibility was there, given that also in a Christian perspective Christ was born under the same Augustus. And so what did this all mean? What did history mean? Right? This was a great concern of humanistic historiography. So Greece and Rome were importantly, if not opposed openly, but distant in these humanistic models from the spontaneous warlikeness of the Germans, so the barbarians, right, opposed to the classical world. So also this concept, you see, a nationalist today, or a racialist, or I'd say whomever cares about this ethnic dimension could say, well, so see, those were those peoples back then in Southern Europe antagonizing with the Germanic principle, and seeing, if you, as we'll see now, especially you start basing yourself on a national belief, which if you look at 16th century Europe, well, more or less, the countries you see on the map, they are the ones that exist today, roughly meant. And of course those national cultures, as we were saying, had already been emerging. But the great problem there is that these started becoming sort of self-referential, forgetting the universal value of the empire. So first of all, the Catholic dimension. Also paganly meant, right? The Reformation having a very specific meaning in that regard. Really, literally having to do with how much works, and so are say functional to grace, and so de facto, what can man do in order to save himself? What does actually happen there? So you understand here all ladders of various steps going downwards in terms of the disintegration of what had been the traditional, primal, unitary, cosmic, universal, imperial ideal. And again, on Schwerpunkt, definitely you can find plenty of content explaining what Europe throughout all this time really was and why these ideas had come to be, right? But when you look at the opposition, say the empire and tribes, and say Romans and the barbarians, as I was saying before, throughout the entire modern age, the concept, after all, that the imperial symbols, at least, right? If you didn't want to see there the continuity necessarily with Rome, etc., but this is mostly in the Protestant world that is, let's remember, minority up to that point. You definitely see a continuity in the same, again, models, meanings, symbolisms, etc. They were all still thinking that the world had to be essentially reunified under a single ruler, right? And this is a concept that fundamentally dies out only sometime between 1792 to 1918, right? And with different degrees of success, by the way. This is not just because they were inspiring themselves with that model that they actually did much of a great impression, depending on who they were, right? We have seen also how Napoleon was using, aside from Roman eagles, etc., but a concept, say, certain universal ideas that in his victories were recognized even by the most autocratic sort of ancien regime foes, as this guy, as sent by God, sent by heaven, right? And still, by Napoleon's times, aside from how mass society was taking over, the European intelligentsia was perfectly aware of what the original meanings really were, at least perfectly. Maybe it's an excess because, as we just said, these values had been deteriorating over time, right? But that's also when, in fact, the philological, historiographical, anthropological, etc., religious understanding were starting to be investigated in an ever more scientific fashion. So rediscovering, as we will see today in the 19th century especially, this enormous world of tradition that many, not just historians, but philosophers, politicians, etc., wanted to revive as a sort of, again, last desperate attempt of a decadent society to actualize the self, and so attain transfiguration and world domination. You can argue that until 1945, as fallimentary this was the actual purpose and attempt. And I do believe, even though I think that, of course, all those who fail on the same traditional basis are losers, and there is no other way around about that, and I will speak more about this in a truly traditional sense, there has been a post-World War II, say, ideological temper that literally decided to erase further, or completely, the awareness of this traditional past that had, after all, been investigated at that point in a particularly thorough way, and in fact had been connected even with the for example, the fascists, the Nazi regimes, etc., in different ways, and even there with gross misunderstandings, and again, just the reflection of essentially mass societies. I mean, what could you expect from them anyway? And that, in fact, has been sort of thrown to the bin, to a Manichaean and sort of iconoclastic way, like saying, if this guy had, sympathies towards fascism, it was not even writing openly in favor of that ideologically, but, had made a great work, say, in the European ideology. Independently from all the ways he could have, say, drawn too much of a boundary or sort of reinforced too much the the categorism, which is a typically also anti-traditional concept, right? Born essentially with the Enlightenment encyclopedism. Well, that would have been thrown away too, and so we should have forgotten about that. We shouldn't quote them, we shouldn't reread them, we shouldn't do anything that makes us think that just because we're opening that book, we're secretly some sort of 19th century racialists, right? Which is a concept that, albeit race actually playing a massive role, that's other thing has been removed from your understanding, fact, of antiquity, was actually not understood in the racialistic terms of the 19th century, which are two very different things from saying, like, as we've been told, in Rome, race did not matter. Right? That's something that I think any person with an elementary Latin literature knowledge can absolutely get pretty disappointed by. And it's obvious that not even PhD in medieval history learn Latin today, so you can imagine what the masses can really do, right? Besides being so proud of their great cultural, moral, and personal accomplishments. So this other idea was thrown around that when the Renaissance was saying, well, look at Rome, it was fundamentally cool, right? And of course the enemies were the barbarians in a sort of archetypal way, right? In the emerging national ideas, this would look like a sort of opposition between, say, the Latins and the Germans, rather than seeing that, say, the same Germans, the same Norse, notoriously, in their own mythology, have, of course, the barbarians, have the race of dumb, stupid, big, but, incapable losers that are tricked by the smart Uranian golden stock of gods that fundamentally rules over them. And that is the symbol of this cosmic order and struggle at the end of the day, because it's always a pretty, conflictual and dramatic picture. There are differences also in the way these words, of course, show the degree by how dramatic this was. The Greeks and the Romans were much more splendidly Apollonian in their view of the world, and you can argue there that they had somehow, from the top of their prosperity, eventually began to decline because of that, whereas, I don't know, the Norse, the Celtic world are much gloomier, much sort of more, at least also for when we can document them, so when the world had been aging consistently and people in these very worlds, like in the Roman or Greek one in the later times, had started to believe that, for example, fate was superior to man. And so these are the same years in which Christianity had taken over as a consequence of this predisposition, and also actually providing with a logical solution if you understand at least the theological implications of Catholicism, as opposed to think also what we've been told, that Christianity arrived, people became passive or weak or peaceful, so incapable of defending themselves. That's not exactly what happened, and even here we have to be careful about what we're saying. So it's erroneous to look at the Renaissance and saying, well, these guys were fixated with Rome. It means they had grievance in any way against the Germans. Again, if you pick, again, the Italian humanist that was witnessing the Spanish, French, German invasions of the peninsula, that's something. But the literal entire rest of Europe was based on the same classical imitation. We will talk recently now about even the specific Protestant and, in that sense, mostly Northern European contribution, the Dutch, the Swedes, the English, to the sense of classical discipline that, I mean, Maurice of Nassau, etc., they were reviving literally from the actual Hellenistic and Roman military manuals. By the way, in a still ancien regime system, right? Not something that was actually given that much room for any sort of democratic or republicanistic system, as people think, right? These were noblemen who thought to be superior to the mass of the people, that now they were essentially just ever more effectively indoctrinating and being passive to their to their order, right, and contributing to it, of course, themselves with, again, reasonable purposes, etc., but not challenging that higher order was inspired, of course, to the ancient stock of rulers, right? Variations also in this tone, but overall the theme is the same. And it's, I think, just by a basic artistic knowledge of European modern Europe, where you can just there are not variations on the theme in practice, right? If not, of course, a poorer art from the people, let's say, would be more, this sense, more contemplative, more secularistic, but authorities having a pretty secure point of reference as far as the traditional values were concerned, as they were also gradually being forgotten in the truer meaning, but for reasons also of, say, distance from the actual necessity of living in a certain way. And again, there were some coming backs, right, as I was saying before, even in mass society, of these values, but in a much more diluted as far as the individual. It was the center, especially the sacred ruler, in that function of world salvation, practically, that had been existing before. And this is even more evident when you realize that, I don't know, the same Protestant creed and so on. But, and of course, atheism kicking in, etc. So, on a cultural level, humanism did bring to this gradual, let's say, not lack of interest, but necessarily contempt, but this sort of shift in the points of references from whatever had been existing as an abundant medieval production, by the way, based on the same models, in simply going back to the spring from which that had arrived, right? So antiquity itself. The Middle Ages were at that point seen, well, but these guys, we were interested in what the original values really were, and they were written down by the ancients. And yes, in the Middle Ages, people were essentially going by them, but they were doing it with less awareness about the actual historiographical issues. So now that we have better philological means, we can simply reacquire, right, the knowledge from the source, from the spring, and bypassing other types of sources that we're not particularly interested in. I mean, it's obvious that I don't know, 15th century humanist, unless it was writing a local history, was on average more about the classics than, I don't know, whichever chronicle had been written, say, in the 12th century, right? But you gotta understand that this doesn't stem from a specific contempt towards the Middle Ages as such, rather than the realization that the world had been falling asleep, and now, these guys were suddenly waking up, at least as a minority, as a true cultural elite, and saying, well, we kind of realized what this is, because we spent so many years actually reconstructing just that, and so we are aware of it. There are so many occultistic circles, there's a risk. These ideas could lead astray, by the way, many people, because it's not much that it was, like, these principles are adopted by Christians as well, but many people at the time began to fall prey of other heresies, and again, the same Reformation, the same anti-Catholic feeling, but generally speaking, some sort of lack of reflection on, again, the original sin and salvation, the necessity of refining the soul, but the thing sort of degenerating at some point just in materialistic alchemy and so on, would create problems. And sometimes we don't even know, of course, to which degree these doctrines were aware of what, right? Think about the Rosicrucians, etc. There was a general awareness of what the ancient wisdom had been about that transcended even the specificities, let's say, of paganism or Christianity, and that in fact was talking to that much more totalizing concept of the self-actualization, that however the ancients being quite aware, as much as many medievals as well, of the not just in the difficulty of its attainment, but in the actual necessity of being out there and fighting and self-sacrificing in holy combat, as opposed to just researching this thing from a historical point of view. All right, it's a huge deal because it entails, as you understand, the entire concept of the empire, and in a Europe that is basically fragmented, like after the 14th century crisis, the papacy and the empire have basically declined. There are, again, these other national monarchies that are taking over without much supervision, right? And so it's obvious that the same principle was so undermined that in spite of the reacquisition of its awareness, a few could do much just to restore the ancient glory, even though the model was truly the same. And there are interesting coming backs exactly in this phenomenon, in these moments of crisis, as we explained before, cyclically. Right? Sometimes those who had the best researchers, the most learned scholars, that would want to emphasize the most that principle, but paradoxically would bring it to further to a quicker end, such as, again, Louis XIV, leading somehow directly to the French Revolution in a non-deterministic way, but in a substantial fashion within the same century, and obviously at that point symbolizing the contrast between the forces of light, the forces of the darkness, in a way that, again, would have been immediately understood by Louis XIV, that was literally depicting himself as a god, having taken the fire back from humanity after the Fronde, right, having tamed it, and so having reestablished the Golden Age, having, of course, gotten rid of Prometheus, having restored the old order. This was self-evidently, iconographically, and macroscopically there, right? And still, again, you can have millions of tourists visiting the same rooms, or the entire Europe where this was the essentially the only model, and literally not understanding what that means. And it gets down just to a sensualistic, aestheticistic thing. Oh, look, this looks cool, but what does it actually mean? Right? We like to think that this was just a word of gossip, a bit of betrayals and hedonism and sort of the rich, while our ancestors were just breaking their backs in the fields, and as if we're here because just it was the fault of these terrible leaders that actually started to move things forward, right, and actually paved the way to what eventually was hijacked by the Fourth Estate, that reduced dramatically the capacity of leadership, and so the possibility of salvation. It's evident that, the fathers of the church were studied in the early modern age, right? And of course, on the wake of the Renaissance, these were seen as still cultured re-elaborators of the classical legacy. The hard-working, as anonymous coping monks were particularly appreciated because they had granted the transmission of the ancient authors without essentially wanting to retouch that. And that's actually a testament truly to the thirst of knowledge of the medieval man that was more inexhaustible than in any other time in history, right? The Enlightenment was mostly about the finding the right categories where to fit knowledge without even technically caring about it more that much. The medieval man was much closer to the traditional idea of wisdom, of actual awareness and consciousness and sort of ability to handle that, and it restores us this sort of fundamentally silent, non-judgmental, sort of discreet and hard-working face, right? It's the same rough brutality of a medieval knight that, however, was closer than ever to the imperial ideal, and being also a great singer, composer, and many other things in that world, right? This is something you don't quite see at the same levels of intensity in the modern age, where actually we do have a lot of proof of how the entire aristocracy was fundamentally obsessed with the same principles, but of course being slightly more distant than what had happened in the Middle Ages, right? It's obvious that the medieval sources to be forgotten the earliest were the chroniclers, the geographers, because there was no, let's say, literary vivacity to some degree, which is also erroneous to think, and many humanists, of course, knew very well medieval chroniclers and geographers, and so even the myth that humanists thought that everything written in the Middle Ages was just rough and harshly sort of condemned as such is not correct. And this is in fact what we hardly get. This is true also for the Byzantine Empire. Like the negative myth wasn't quite born so universally, right, until the Enlightenment. And then we had to rediscover that, but having lost trace of its traditional symbolism. When you look at the 17th, the 18th century, among intellectuals that had a spontaneous curiosity for the past, you realize that there was a measured as positive consideration of the Middle Ages after all. Even essentially after the wake of the Renaissance, and so this classicism. If you look at the Jean Mabillon, but especially Louis de Tommasson and Ludovico Antonio Muratori, you realize that it was the true beginning, especially with the latter, of what would become the modern medieval historiography by moral and scientific standard, right? It's rather the Enlightenment that ruins everything, because, of course, the values of the elite that were the traditional ones could not be proposed to a rebellious mass that also didn't, of course, understand anything about history or religion factually. The Enlightenment was also essentially a self-sabotage by many authors who were simply saying, well, the ancien regime has lots of faults, let's tear it down because we can't get anything from that, so let tradition fundamentally die with that. And so all the obscurantistic prejudices about the Middle Ages and religion and the role of universal institutions politically was cancelled, right? Of course, not completely, because not all Europe was an enlightened cafe, let's say, but that's also an aspect that we should appreciate, right? The fact that there was a lot of the past awareness surviving throughout these terrible times. And I say terrible because they really were. I mean, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, of course, have been purposely portrayed to us as uniquely positive moments, right? But they were actually, by those people who lived within the same, considered as some of the most terrifying times ever. I mean, the Renaissance was literally the loss of balance, of a center of gravity. Hence, also, the Baroque architecture, the sense that the older Christian unity was being destroyed. There were these outer worlds, nobody understood what was happening. The Enlightenment brought straight to the revolutions, and so in the Napoleonic Wars, and hardly a moment of particular happiness overall, and actually one of great agitation. But also, and one must understand that, of reflection coming with the crisis regarding why what was happening was actually happening, right? So today's foundations of the prejudices against the Middle Ages are fundamentally located in the Enlightenment, in part the French Revolution, but especially the French Revolution, of course, that was reviving the Greek and Roman past in a way that was literally pasting and copying, hoping that the real world in the 18th century could work like, I don't know, the one of the second BC, and essentially pushing the most secularistic, atheistic, and sort of in part materialistic and deterministic sense of the need of the ideals of reason, but meant as rationalism fundamentally, and liberalization and equality to be imposed. All right. This is not the entire picture either. I made a video about the sort of the traditional aspects of Enlightenment that were present as well. I mean, there is always a tension between those who want to give more power to, say, the masses in order to allow them to participate successfully into these cycles of Western expansion that, in fact, historically always happened through this, enlightened elites that were able to lead the masses, but never the masses actually doing anything on their own, to, in fact, invert, instead of sort of contracting cycle that would have made the system collapse anyway. And this is what happened with the ancien regime itself, right? So the idea that in every man there is a spark of divinity is, of course, fundamentally the same principle that Christianity but also the traditional, much more sort of discriminating traditional principle was concentrated on. It is to say, the ideal of equality is not an ideal of, let's say, communistic nature, right? The ideal of equality should be that if we are all provided with the highest standards, we are a stronger body than we aren't, right? And indeed, historically, say that the most prosperous societies were the ones that were able to rise more balanced, more equilibrated, and so with a capacity of collective impact that could be greater, even conquest, etc. We'll say about now, because there is always sort of an ambiguity between communitarism and multiculturalism, right? The problem of equality is just pretending that a person is valuable when in action they aren't, right? It's the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, right? You should motivate, you should always stimulate the divine spark within every person, because that can save the world in theory. But if in practice doesn't do that, well, then you have to be harsh and to instill some greater values, also force them, right? And if these people fail in doing so and they sink, well, they may deserve that, but they may bring the entire system down, especially if you want just to exploit them until they're consumed, and then you don't have anything to stand on, which happened to many cultures historically. So if you look at the war of the American independence, if you look at the French Revolution, different phenomenon, of course, but let's say when someone wants to see the negative in it, at least as I see on YouTube, it often happens because, after all, it's a mass media, so the mass part shouldn't surprise you in this outcome. Well, the idea is, well, I don't know, the French Revolution was entirely bad. There was nothing positive about that. It's so bad. And why? Because at the end of the day, you're a nationalist, you know it deep inside, so you don't think about actual imperial Catholic tradition. You're only concerned about a non-transcendental piece of dirt where, by world standards, evidently the average inhabitant is just disgusting, whichever country, even the best in the world, really is. And so you fail to see, you simply abandon your intellect and decide that one given phenomenon is entirely unmotivated or savage or useless, when many were, but not to the entire degree, right? I'm definitely not a fan of the French revolutionary ideals as such, but I'm also sort of maybe continental enough, and so maybe that's my part of nationalism emanating here from my ideas, that says, well, but it's not what happened during the French Empire. It was specifically just a negative evenience, right? And you can't quite entrench yourself behind the same Berg, etc., and say, well, I follow that because I belong to that club, even though you do not factually know much of what even happened during the French Revolution or the Napoleonic era, right? And what was happening from the other side, right? Because that system was unhinged in the end. So if you were betting on that, of course, good. But how eroded was it? And how back in time do you really go in terms of what your standards are? Because you can argue that already by, say, the 18th to 19th century, independently from whichever country you live, there was hardly anything traditional left, essentially in the essence of the political institutional cultures that we're looking at. The other aspect, of course, that was not understood, in fact, in the instances of the revolutionaries, was that a great deal of that imbalance that had formed to the point of the ancien regime to collapse, and so with an elite failing evidently, if that was the only measure of evaluation, was the fact that all that imbalance had affirmed itself rather in the 17th and the 18th century, wasn't quite belonging. Say the medieval world that in many ways continued to live in even throughout those centuries was actually much more balanced and obvious and logical and sort of inescapable in that order that still had produced part of what was not working anymore by that point. The 19th century and Restoration brought a great reaction, as you understand, against all these revolutionary, egalitarian, liberal, rationalistic ideas, right? Romanticism in many ways is, in its immensity and diversity, in part about this, right? In good part about this. The rediscovery of national identities was, however, mostly an anti-traditional process, right? It, from one side, was contrasting correctly what the Enlightenment had extremized in the sense of sort of blind cosmopolitanism, and so sort of multiculturalism, a purely universal sense of equality without looking at the actual differences between peoples. On the other hand, it was basing essentially the entire point on the people only, and not on even on the universal purpose to attain, right? After all, when you look at rampant nationalism in the 19th or 20th century, and it doesn't matter how close certain regimes went to sort of world domination to some aspect, you don't quite find, also because they never came truly close to it in practice, but you never actually find the sense that the paradigm that was being used officially by these polities to actually have a truly universal meaning, right? It was one country, mostly referencing to itself in function of the surrounding European ones, that of course were the world leaders, but say if we're talking about the German desire for world domination, it wasn't much of the fact, because this is what the point is, that German nationalism just per se was a product of a doctrinal universal will of domination, in which the nation had this sort of elect role, just like Rome had, right? And the Germans had the Holy Roman Empire. You understand why there was that sense of the Reich and of the possibility of recollecting that. But this was a mass society, de facto. At least was to become, because the German unification is really what makes that happening. But it was still essentially solicited by the start of, say, the acceleration in that direction, also because the restoration failed, evidently, to maintain the ancien regime, right? It lasted, at the longest 1 century, depending on the countries. In many of them, some of the most important, actually, it didn't. But the point I was making is that this will to power was mostly a sense of, okay, I'm a German, I want to crush the French. Because, well, we've been kind of been told that I'm German, so technically, it doesn't matter whether I'm Saxon or Bavarian or whatever, but I'm kind of German. And maybe, there is some sort of pan-Germanistic idea of whatever, but who cares about the Swedes or, but I'm really pissed by France, because France is preventing my, rise to power as a great nation, and all I want is fundamentally the colonies of this power. I mean, they were reasoning in these terms, not in saying, I want to transfigure the world in holy combat, because I want to become a god myself, and this entails that there must be a literal disappearance of the same nation in the process, to literally making the universe entirely back to one. I mean, it's something so big that at that point anything earthly doesn't have any meaning in comparison. This is the path that very often is forgotten. Like, if I say on YouTube, for example, this is normal, I made videos in the past in this sense, I'm right-wing, but I think nationalism is for losers. Of course, a person that has never known tradition, or never understood the sense of imperial Catholic tradition, and literally thinks that Catholic is just a Christian thing and nothing else, and that wasn't actually a pagan principle, what chance is there for a person to understand how much nationalism is anti-traditional and literally the first step into socialism, and eventually into communism, and so fulfilling the dramatic prophecy of all the traditional religions regarding the end of the world, right? This is the real problem. We live in a world in which literally most people reason in these terms, and they do not just do this and say, well, okay, from my state, from my country, from my nation, I will be able to take it to reconquer the world, and so this spirit actually makes this nation ever more powerful. No, all countries on that path are becoming all weaker, and the whole world is getting weaker. Right? I mean, right now there isn't any power in the world that actually has a proper trace of tradition, if not just as a bit of paint on it, and actually having consistently nothing to do with that. But people still thinking that, if you back that power because you want to go in function of that other, that is supposedly a moral value, when you're actually setting your moral horizon exclusively to some failing earthly states without soul and without identity and without and so a made-up identity, as a matter of fact, one that flattens everything and everyone to the standard of you have a passport from that country. You may be a completely ignorant, stupid, person lacking any sort of trace of parental upbringing or first world primary education standards, even if you actually have a paper that says that you have. But just because you belong to that group, you can't avoid to see the putrescence of your personal, moral, and cultural failure. Not just as an individual, but literally as the entire environment that has produced you, as an abortion of human dignity. If any person had an idea of this, as much as one of their own limits, of course we would perhaps start to reapproach the idea of transcendence and of the sacred and tradition, right? Which is not just going to church or claiming that you are this or that. It is something that you must work your entire... You should be able to sacrifice yourself into, and so not just making you feel a bit cozier just before you die and dissolve without having practically accomplished anything for your own salvation and the one of the world, and so literally with the increased chance of disappearing forever, in the best scenario, which is terrifying enough. So in fact, this is a process that religions themselves underwent. I mean, it's, even if you need to create hell, to scare people, just with this figurative tortures that are physical, etc. What is worse than literally disappearing? Non-existing, right? This is not to say it's not going to come through a terrifying experience, and say the earthly one is pretty scary already by itself, but you understand that there the physicality, the lack of spiritual dimension has already taken over as a concept. So what did Romanticism do in the process? Well, it essentially began to reevaluate what the Enlightenment had defined as a superstition. For example, magical and fairy tale-like aspects were reevaluated. Within this universal fractioning, there was a greater attention towards the roots of national civilizations. Doesn't matter whether authentic or invented, made up. We all know that, say, most national ideologies in the nationalistic sense are fundamentally 19th century fabrications. I mean, there are certain countries specifically that literally didn't have that even in the 19th century, or at least they had it to a degree that was definitely much less, much more superficial than what other bigger, more important countries, of course, had historically, right? So, but everybody had their tiny flag to wave for, of course, having a place in the world, but completely making up values, identities, a sense of belonging that, by the way, would have been completely and ideologically opposite to whatever those leaders of the true past time, which this nation had began to emerge, literally believed in. Right? When you understand as a nationalist that your ideology is a leftistic, terroristic, fourth estate one, right, from the hardcore left, and that, even just in the 18th century, the great leaders that you look up to of your country were people that thought that you were an inferior, racially inferior person just because you belonged to the peasantry. Well, then you have the actual revelation of how disgusting, right, by any, again, standard, this mythology fundamentally is. And that's the reason why actually nationalism is bad. I mean, nationalism is not as bad because in the dimension in which it appreciates the nation. It's in the moment in which it becomes truly nationalism, which is another thing, which is a needless emphasis on something that already in the actual reality, and especially the one that has been created in the 19th century, is of much lower quality than it had ever existed historically. And it was enforced exactly for making the lesser people less challenged in their own deeply rooted inferiority. This is what this fundamentally is. The next step is, if we are alike because we belong to this nation, well, we need to be maintained parasitically. Nationalism, again, brings to socialism, and socialism brings to communism. One can argue that the most successful nations were the ones that had somehow cultivated a true sense of cohesion, and not the one that, say, for example, emerged with... Why did, I don't know, socialism take over Eastern Europe, right? There's a very specific reason there, because there hadn't quite been that cohesion historically, that the same communistic regimes, after all, were stressing in a national sense, right? There can't be nationalism without socialism. And this is very hard for some people to understand fundamentally. Every single socialistic regime historically was pushing a nationalist agenda within to maintain power, and not optionally, right? And also macroscopically so, and pretty notoriously from a historiographical point of view. But people literally, and this is a problem, I know I speak mostly to an American audience that was habituated to sort of immediately categorize what kind of race, faith, nationality you come from, because the US was built like with all these various groups that had to sort of identify each other. But the rest of the world doesn't reason like this. There are some stronger substrata that fundamentally are not like exchangeable cosplaying identities that through which you can't simply label people and regimes and whatever. You must go through a very elaborated historical process in order to actually understand what, in fact, also a non-self-referential history is fundamentally about. And that's the reason why, again, YouTube is filled with this incredibly shallow content that focuses on, again, sort of basic, say, categoristic identities, mostly based on national stereotyping and nothing else. That is not even close to, like, if you want to make the history of a country, do it, but just make history, just make the history that we know very well. No, the Fourth Estate does not want to hear that, because that reminds them, of course, of how much of a failure they are. And so it's a vicious cycle that constantly reignites itself, right? So as I was saying, I will make a video about the Germans, right? And today we will talk about this nation because, as you know, Germany was a bit the fatherland of, you can say or at least the greatest expression of Romanticism, also in a political, national, and cultural identity. Right? Nationalism had, again, as a germ, always been there. Ideally, there had always been somebody that said, "I am from this nation, so I'm owed something." Right? Germany has always been a sort of exception in many ways. It's a sort of frontier area, right, between Western and Central Europe, between sort of modernity and tradition, between, in this case, the Enlightenment and Romanticism. And part of the reasons of the German success during the 19th and 20th century, of course, stems from this, right? When you realize that the various peoples that at some point took over or had their heyday, their sort of peak in European history. There are very few countries in Europe that didn't have this. You realize that they had their moments, of course for contingental reasons, but fundamentally in the moment in which their country saw the meeting of tradition and modernity at the same time. At some point you have the peak, then it exhausts itself, and let's say the the more recent, usually the more short-lived, right? And of course, technology, think about nuclear weapons, etc., brought to some powers to be more relevant than others, etc. So it's not really a law, but that of course evolved also more or less in parallel, right? Especially in Europe, where there was always a great civilizational homogeneity in development, especially in the West, and in fact beyond in the West also broadly meant. So I will not descend specifically in the Sonderweg, but we all know what fundamentally German, the appeals of German cultural identity fundamentally is about, right? We can talk about it more extensively in some other videos, but it's exactly this sense of being, yes, modern, efficient, cold, but also traditional, also sort of folkloristic, also sentimental, right? The Sturm und Drang is in part this, and it's the capacity of controlling the strongest passions, because you have an ever greater sort of self-control, reason, etc. This doesn't mean that, of course, think about the dramatic defeats of Germany in both world wars that are as definitive as and appealable. Of course, there were other German successes, let's say, from the Franco-Prussian War. Even the fact that, as you know, mostly the Axis power they after World War II, in spite defeated, actually they grew to be essentially some of the richest and especially longest living peoples in the world. There is no doubt that there's a charm there, aside from the large amount of German ancestry in the United States, and so sort of even in that after World War II, that deal against the Soviets, for which the Germans were restored the lost honor of World War II, became the gallant knights that had fighting for the fatherland and not the, in fact, nationalist, socialist motherfuckers. But of course, it's the same country. This is true for the same country at the same time, right? There was a part of that and a part of the other. Otherwise, they would have not also given that much of a headache, right? In the process. And of course, when we look at the First World and the Second World War, the not just the German culture. I mean, every European country basically had this as both nationalists and socialists to some degree. But definitely Germany erupted in that sort of more prepotent way through the brewing of these ideologies that were extremely effective, even like what the thing that, for example, Mein Kampf I think it's a bad read, and it's not interesting, if not for one aspect that struck me that when I read it the first time, that it's by reading it, I truly understood how much scared of idealism, of course, post-World War II world really was. Even if they say those who had taken over in universities had not been sort of Marxist-leaning scholars, like you really understand if Hitler's ideology was stemming from that degree of, let's say, idealistic lucidity, if we can't say so. Well, why this? All this traditional knowledge was so much of a deal, not because the Nazis interpreted particularly well, also because they failed, and so that's actually the thing. They also misused and practically didn't read even my beloved von Clausewitz, so I have some personal problem with that too, aside from the rest. But there are interesting anecdotes I could tell you also from my family during World War II at some point. That always highlight this duality after all. And indeed, there was an awareness of oneself and of one's past within the German people. The 19th century masses, again, didn't understand practically anything into this, like we're just drunk into this sort of extremistic, beast-like sort of ideas. But there was, of course, in the German unification some important achievement, to say the least. This people was essentially searching for its own political unity, right? This is also a thing for many other countries in Europe at the time. In part, this was just reinforcing the disgregational process more than else. Think about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in that regard, in fact, the Germans did the opposite. They managed to unify where the others, say, at least as the Habsburgic Empire had maintained, at least the until Napoleon, the imperial, and even later, even though depleted from the Holy Roman character title, right, to do the same. Even though they were offered, etc. We'll have to make a bit of 19th century history in Schwerpunkt. I diverted from that, but it's still and obviously important to appreciate. So it's obvious that the German nationalistic and romanticistic movement would look at, let's say, the moment of greatest power of a German nation intended in the Latin sense, right, which is in fact technically not what the 19th century nation technically is, right? And we should make a video explaining a bit there what the difference between patria, natio, etc., because these have also, patria is just like fatherland in the European root, so it's different times use different words also there with a degree of sort of linguistic, etymological degeneration, because people don't study their own languages anymore. But it's obvious that what we have described also on Schwerpunkt very often as the myth of the empire and the Hohenstaufen was, and the other great heroes like Otto I. So these are normally also Charlemagne in a more battle way with the French, but we'll explain it now. Otto I, Frederick Barbarossa, right? These are the big guys, as true heroes, right, of the German nation, at least as it was understood at this point. So medieval history would take up an invariably great importance in German history, because there was at that point also a chance of national monarchy achievement, which however failed, as you know, with the disintegration of the same during the 13th century. And so basically the fragmentation is this enormous blob of 300 states gradually reduced, but fundamentally remaining all scattered until the 1870s, and still within the German Federation, in fact being states on their own, because of how deeply ingrained this sort of historical process had happened. Naturally, the Germans began to say, well, this was our way of doing that. As I said before, likely they were right in seeing a positive sort of mix, like in not a full absolute state like in the Jacobin model, etc., but also not a properly fragmented one like it had been the German kingdom up to recently. So there would be a lot to tell, even of the inheritance during, say, the nationalist socialist times of the older royal titles of Prussia and all this stuff. Hitler was technically king of Prussia, like if you don't know, at least for what that meant at the time, because they were also rigidly conservative in so many aspects, and Germany was also very different within itself. So there were all these questions about what that did have to be, and of course centuries of lack of national unification do bear, right, their consequences. Right, in part they can be positive, but overall, if you want to have a strong, solid state that at least manages to achieve results, you have to at least work really a lot, and you have to be to expect to fail really a lot, like in the world wars, by the way. historiographically speaking, from this German turbulence, we can say, were born initiatives of undebatable and long-lasting quality. I mean, as medievalists, we are raised with the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, right? Very serious scholars like Savigny, Weiss, Hartmann, Lamprecht essentially agglutinated an enormous amount of culture, of specialists of the history of law, of institution, of economy, of civilization in general. And so Germany, as the major European countries essentially unified by the 19th century, was producing, of course, a dramatic output, intelligence, and scientific production, right? So it's within this context that the 19th century Germans began to deal with the Middle Ages, yet with a strong ideological load, right? This is crucial to understand. In the past of Europe, they chose essentially to analyze, to reflect upon what we can call the most Germanic period, right? Freeing it of, in part, those peculiar expressions of a Latin culture that had evidently been dominated, not just the continent at the time, just by osmosis, by an emanation, but that had remained so deeply ingrained, as we've seen throughout all the Ancien Regime, through the myth of the classics, of Roman law, for example. I just have realized I want to make a bit about Roman law in the same Germany during the modern era to complete our series on technically medieval law, but that has to make you understand this other passage as well. So again, in this time and place, lots of things were going on actually, so we can't quite just say, well, that's only what the Germans did. But, right, we're talking definitely of a strongly idealized national history, at least, which stemmed, and you must think about that. This is true also for Italy, for example, that, as you know, was unified just 10 years, more or less unified 10 years before the same Germany, and these were countries that had some other adjustments historically, with other acquisitions and losses and so on, and that are two major pillars, in fact, of the same medievalistics, right? But that in the age of nationalism were obviously complex for not having achieved a national union politically in the previous centuries. Different stories, different peoples, different past, but still, in part recovering medieval history because just of the greatness of the country's history, but because they had not, like for example England or France, at some point got fed up with their own older regime, in a way. Don't get me wrong, we all know that Britain and France were very, one of the most two, important countries in the spread of Romanticism, etc. But there was, especially in France, of course, that greater, because Britain at least still had the monarchy that served that specific purpose for the parliament, from the civil war, etc. But always having this other sense of positivistic, if you want, anti-spiritualistic, depending on, because positivism, telling the truth, is not even fully opposite to spiritualism, but emphasizing instead the need of modernization, of secularization. And so, in the peak, like Britain and France, of course, in the 19th century being the most powerful nations on earth, but remember what I said before, exactly when you are at the peak, you are also, yes, they're expressing this enormous amount of geniuses in all fields of science, of literature, art, etc. industrial powers, etc., in colonial empires, but still, right, having to cope with the problems, right, related to this sort of disease of abundance. Again, the same rise of Germany, the let's say the threats coming from different competitors and each other. By the way, because in all this there wasn't a single universal empire, right? Germany was sort of recovering this idea, at least as the hegemonic continental power, right? France had historically been practically always. Now, Germany, when it was finally unified for the first time in history, because it had truly never been, right? Again, also in the 12th century, there was not a technical unification of the country, and especially under, of course, a modern state unitly. This power, as it's the first one in Europe still today, having this enormous potential finally expressed. Also here, with what? With a country that was fundamentally ancien regime until up to that point, but that was immediately unified with its Zollverein, with industrialization, railroads, literally exploded to a level that not just, say, defeating France in the essentially just before in order to unify, but it's so challenging, essentially the greatest continental power, truly, and the country that had maintained essentially the highest military standards historically. It would actually keep maintaining that, because also Germany did, yes, achieve these standards, but let's not forget that it still sort of had pretty heavy blows and back and forth, etc., with the world wars, but not only, right? If you look at, we'll have to make a video about the Franco-Prussian War and realizing how, say, the Germans managed to win without being more advanced than the French. This was another obsession of the 19th century, being more advanced than others, and so having to make up this idea that is somehow regurgitating today when self-sabotaging your own country in favor of some ethnicistic model, like it often happens for Germany, like saying, Britain should have not entered World War I because we lost so many people, and after all, what was Germany doing? Sure, Germany wasn't doing anything, right? That also, of course, Britain wasn't doing, but in a way, of course, I think that it was positive for Britain herself to enter World War I, and keeping to whine about the myth of the butchers is just a fourth estate or populistic superstition. It's not actual moral or scientific awareness of any kind, even when you actually find alleged scholars claiming that. Because let's stop pretending that just because you're a scholar, right? This is again a superstition that we do not believe in continental Europe. Like you are supposed to say, just to be an authority, a god, sent figure, right? This is mostly like a concept that spread mostly in the Anglosphere. Exactly because the guys in Oxford and Cambridge literally believed that they were the literal continuators of the classical Greek and Roman legacy, right? But let's skip this aspect, right? Because they're very interesting as a matter of fact, but just say, as you understand here, I'm sort of butchering every nationality, but it's important to understand that as Europeans we are really made like this, right? That the great part of our success historically derives exactly from this constant sort of conflict, competition, cooperation, and we wouldn't be what we are if it wasn't the case, right? So I could stop here technically because the video is very long. I would like to do it in 2 chunks, but let's go on a little bit, because that's where we enter some of the most important terrain as far as especially as a medievalist, let's say, we are concerned, because it's obvious that in order to evaluate the Germanic past, which was also recovered mostly by Germany because of pan-Germanistic ideas, so it's not much that, yes, there were some racialistic phenomena also in World War II, for which there was this greater idea of the northern race. Think about all the Scandinavian volunteers in the SS, in fighting in the ice, like also the famous Charlemagne unit, right, from France. So there was this truly Germanistic awareness to some degree that, however, never was fully bought by the world entirely. I mean, even Britain, as fundamentally a Germanic counter, existed. The Nazis, the same U.S. in part. There was always a component, of course, of the people who was seduced by white supremacism, and to the sense that, I don't know, after all, Hitler wasn't doing that bad, and still people believe this today. But it's obvious that, again, on the same traditional basis, this would fail, because if you are defeated by who you consider actually racially inferior people, well, you may want to check your background in that sense, because, I mean, if the ultimate proof of your entire deal with this world domination is that you're superior to the others and that you cannot fail because of that, why did you fail? Right? That's what an Indo-European knight from the second millennium BC would have immediately asked. Those who were even getting themselves killed till the last, of course, in this sort of deeply believed thing. Right? What is fascinating about this is that truly until this is valid in part even for the communists, right, that were able to get themselves killed for their own ideal. But when you understand what was agitating, especially the Nazi-fascist regimes, and that, I say, not the majority, not even close to that, but still a relevant part of these people literally did get themselves killed because they had an option not to, but they fought to the death because they truly believed in part, not the truly traditional deal, but something that was heading somewhere around it. Well, you're sort of struck because you say, but wait a minute, these people fought and died in the generation of our grandparents, and we have changed so much, right, to some degree. This is not even, let's leave aside Nazi fascism or any other ideology, but just pick, I don't know, the average guy in World War I. Today, we have this disgusting third millennium movies that always show the kid that was indoctrinated by propaganda and that discovered that, surprise, surprise, war was ugly and bad. Well, they knew that when they were doing there. And not only that, they fought, they died, and those who survived actually came back home and they started alive. Right? This is not to be disrespectful towards all the people who were shell-shocked, who basically died inside in the trench, they went on biologically living on, and all the disaster that was, a loss of human life. But say there was nothing, right, culturally speaking, that equates to today's level of sort of hysteria and weakness and softness, etc., towards conflict in general, which is cool. I mean, it's not even about being weaker, it's being completely clueless about what war is. Right, the notion of going to fight and die for your country was completely accepted. This is not that there weren't people that didn't want to desert and that didn't want to fight, conscience objectors, etc. But generally speaking, people did this. And they were, say, okay with the idea of this existing as a normal eventuality. And guess why? Because up to that point in history, there wasn't, first of all, much of another option, because just polities were more unstable, and so this was sort of, the norm. But people also understood that. They weren't whining about that experience, because back in the day, the greatest honor had always been conceived as dying for, some say fatherland, but it's a very, again, modern sort of nationalistic concept, was a much higher ideal of world domination. And basically, the entire ancient doctrines are about this. The Middle Ages fundamentally were already about this, was still about this. And again, you have gradually this thing diluting, with individuals wanting to do ever less and less, and falling out of religion, of beliefs, of standards, etc., and getting ever weaker to a degree that affects also the way we handle this civilization, this function, to essentially a breaking point. Right, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a nuclear disaster or whatever, but it will simply, we're limited now. Right, it's a phase of essential tiredness, of exhaustion, of sort of slow down, right, of burnout, which in part can even be understandable, but that always starts from the moral dimension, not much from other factors, because you can't quite even see any other, right? If you have what we have, it's because somebody worked their ass off for it. It's not because things began to put themselves one on the pile of the other for us to have what we have, materially speaking. So materialism has more than one problem, just in theory. Again, I'm not sure whether I should go on with this, because it's there are so many things here. I could stop here, right? And yes, let's look like this. I will complete this video tomorrow, right? We can add some other idea about this overall, such as the fact that this order of ideas, first of all, as an introduction to what we have to say tomorrow, is particularly important, right? The fact that we have been deprived of the actual understanding of traditional knowledge, and tomorrow we will see how this was hijacked fundamentally by the sort of even some of the most famous ideologies that were fundamentally contradicting each other, right? When I say that nationalism and socialism come with the same thing, when you look at communitarism and multiculturalism, you can interpret them to make them overlap. That's how it happened with primitive communism. It was hijacked by Marx and Engels, for example. It started as a communitaristic, so-called Marktgenossenschaft theory, right, of the ancient Germanic communitarian village. And naturally, today we interpret these things in different ways, but the core concept of it, that is to say, what did happen to Europe during the Middle Ages that made things go the way it did? Or and what role did nations have? Even when we intend nations in a primitive sense, right? When we can't even neatly identify them, right? What is Germanic, for example? By the 6th century, you can start saying what it is, right? Without too many approximations. The question is, what was it before? Was it there? This doesn't have to mean no, right? As I explained, I think that there is always some sort of deeper substratum to contemporary national identities that lays deep into properly the millennia, and that cannot quite be unrecognized, right? But if I say so, automatically, even though I believe, of course, that identities were, say, single, and I'll always say it in my videos actually, that other clanic, tribal, but in some ways also individual, when you understood that what that individual was meant to be, especially in the case of the sacred royalty, etc., were more important than this overall one that was essentially established in an ethnographic sense with some degree of linguistic approximation. The idea is that you are basically pushing for a sort of in fact nationalistic at best and racistic at worst interpretation of history, and that this sort of identities in many ways were made up, right, in beyond some character that would have existed before. And again, I'm okay with the fact that, of course, in the 19th century and beyond this, or even before, at some point, when they were made up, nothing is sort of just emerging from, let's say, everything changes. At some point, you have to define them. But in fact, nothing also emerges just by itself, right? You must understand where that root relate. And I always, I remember a comment, I think it was last year, from a guy who was listening to my reflections of the anti-traditional nature of nationalism, and he said, well, but I'm more curious, let's say, about the role of nations in tradition. That is to say, what do they actually mean, right? Is there nothing to that? There is nothing to nationalism, but definitely there's a lot about nations. And it can be difficult to grasp, right? The main attitude, as we will see better tomorrow, is to essentially say that since an identity was not expressed, it didn't quite exist, and or was more basic, more short range geographically, and therefore it could not be quite recognized, especially if it's not in fact explicitated, documented. This is a fair point if you realize that historically nothing had come to at that point to be called like that in a true sense. I mean, if you look at that's why the German Romanticism is interesting, because you don't quite understand where Germany ends, right? The thing says wherever the German voice rings, right? And so this referred even more to the Middle Ages, to the sort of push towards the East, right? The German colonization of vast areas of Central and Eastern Europe during the High Middle Ages. And that is that opens to a question, is to say, okay, but where do you draw there the boundary before, right? When is that you can actually start talking about in fact of German and not Germanic? Because you see, later on you would say, well, this is German, this is not sweet. That's just like by the late Middle Ages you can say that easily, right? We could have said it with a certain level of ease even before. The question is, however, at which point did that Germanness and sweetness come to be in a way that they would encompass such, say, a regional dimension without being confused like with something else locally, and how this something else locally was distinguished from, say, the respective regions? That's a much more complicated thing to answer, right? It's easier, let's say, the way it's formulated here doesn't perhaps help, but in more practical terms, you lack those comparative statements, and so it's quite complicated to even just describe at that point whether this should be a German nationalism or sort of pan-Germanism of some sort. The same goes for pan-Slavism, right? Slavs naturally hate pan-Slavism today. Guess why, right? The Russian imperialism, communism, I mean the Soviets at least, in that sense, because there is again always a national feeling also within communistic regimes, at least in practice. In theory you shouldn't. Made a video about the Bolshevik ideology in that regard. And other countries do not quite develop that very much. For example, the Romance world did hardly ever join forces in a nationalistic sense, right? The French had always sort of quite clear what the Italians were and vice versa, the Spanish were, and nobody really said, well, okay, we should all join forces as Latins, because no, right? The Germans had in this sense a bit of a problem themselves. And you know why? Because these were, just like with Britain eventually, the largest and best defined and sort of more civilizationally continuous and stratified and rich defined countries in Europe. So it's a bit different when you look at the Slavic world, for example, and you want to draw the same sort of distinction between the various nationalities. That, of course, are important, but I am not saying that those differences do not exist. They do, right? And they're often more marked, in fact, than what it's generally believed, because at some point somebody came around and said, well, in the 19th century, this people and this other essentially made up their own national homogeneity. Yes, but there was still something about that you have to reevaluate, and you should reevaluate, of course, at that point, the traditional way. So essentially the elite, and the rest being peasants, and being there a ferocious divide between them more than, say, even different national neighbors. And that's something you can see at different levels. For example, if you look at 10th century Europe, you realize that, especially in post-Carolingian Europe, so across essentially a Latin-Germanic world, the milites recognized all themselves as a military class without too much of a pickiness, right? And at that point, the idea of the universal empire was also much more alive. So you should explain why, for example, those were surely more traditional times than before, but nations had less importance than they had later. And the obvious answer is yes, the destruction of universal ideas together with the sacred passes through the creation of nationalism and socialism. Right? But if one doesn't get this straight, or at all, because I've truly never heard anyone that would be so convinced of this, right, and explaining it clearly, etc. You will always sit there thinking that, well, after all, I'm either right wing or left wing, and that's basically it, right? There are just a bunch of guys that I hear about in the media or in history books that were kind of the guys that were communists and the kind of guys who were capitalists, without even knowing that capitalist is a contemptive term used by communists to define essentially just free market. Because in the 19th century, right, some idiot decided that in the 20th some other decided that had to be imposed to kids, and that's how we go. So hardly much of an accomplishment. If it wasn't for the fact that there is always a traditional vein limiting to those who want to make serious history and that want to unveil, I think, a picture that is I think it's difficult to unveil for those who literally do not have any historical interest whatsoever, right? So this can be a way of seeing it, at least, and I'm pretty interested in this. And this is just, again, half of a video that is, however, just an introduction to the to other topics that we'll have to make, especially about the Romans and the Germans. You understand that this dichotomy is the one around which the world polarized, right? Especially in Europe, in the continent, France and Germany essentially dictating this, like, the antagonism between the two always having to do with two different cultural, ethno-linguistic areas that in between also had a lot of, say, what is here exactly, right? And what is that we should think in the transcendence of the empire, right? There were French subjects of the empire that existed, properly the Kingdom of France conquest. And this happens in many. The interesting aspect of this is that even in the creation of the nation state, you have these instances. You have some ethnics of another, say, people of different ethnicity that, however, feel that they are citizens of that country. This happened, I don't know. There were traditionally, if you think about, the Istria or Dalmatia for Italy, there were lots of Slavs inhabiting there that considered themselves Italians politically. I mean, they spoke Slav, they were Slav, they were named as Slavs, but they, at some point, preferred to say, like, I want to actually be an Italian citizen. And because we have always coexisted in that. This is happening really very, very, very frequently. Think about, Bohemia. We discussed it also in the modern age. What's the difference at some point in there, historically, between Slavs and Germans? Surely there is. There are even very neatly defined areas where you can see that, the core was essentially Slav and the outer part was German, but in between, right? The very famous sort of Germanizations of Slavic names in the frontier area that made videos on, it was about Ottonian warfare and the fact that essentially Eastern Germany was inhabited by the Slavs at some point, and prior to that it was also inhabited by the Germans. So you understand at that point how even so relevant the question of the Eastern expansion, the Lebensraum, the idea of the hatred towards the Slavs, and certain ideologies in National Socialism, for example, stemming from sort of German history came from. Another very important thing is to assess the fact that peoples were always aware of their own ethnic differences, but this doesn't mean that they couldn't cooperate in that regard. So definitely the 19th and the 20th century brought to, say, genocide, say, the ideologies of these centuries brought just essentially to the latter, to genocide, but being cultivated from an idea of a past where, of course, this struggle existed, but paradoxically was better understood traditionally in this sense, also in a deeper way, because the divide was not much ethnic, but let's say, we could say social, even though it was still understood as ethnic, but meaning that a person was better than another if they were more powerful. And in the 19th century, in the 20th century, this flattened to, okay, this is based on just what language you speak, without even realizing what your worth really was. This was naturally a product also of the necessities of homogenization, administratively, institutionally. You must have a greater unity of command to some degree, but this shouldn't have to do, in a truly national sense, with the possibility of these nationals in the regard, say, to the possibility of joining forces together. Hence the importance of the spark of divinity. And the nation, say, the nation as such, of course, being more homogeneous historically, makes it easier to reach that level of homogeneity, also the statal political level. And of course, these countries normally work better, right? But they also work well enough when there are causes of major force, as you can say, for example, I don't know, in the early Middle Ages, where there was definitely a synthesis of the Latin-Germanic elements in the West, and successfully reaching a civilizational result, because they understood how to operate, even within that hierarchy of values and values of people even that did exist, but was in fact mostly based on the status of the person for what it was objectively recognized, and not being a blind thing like, you know, that guy belongs to that nationality or to that other, and so that's the only discriminant that we need to know, right? And of course we understood this, we understand this still, because I don't think that any person that just looks at another ever thinks that they're alike just because they belong to a group, whichever it is. But we should recover the awareness of the fact that group divides, for how they historically form, are actually pretty strong, right? Throughout all my life, and also, say, historical experience, I had to realize that differences between groups are much greater than we normally would like to credit. Because it would be great to have just like different people all being sort of, let's say, so it wouldn't be necessarily great to have them different, of course, because they you wouldn't also know where to get from. But at the beginning, you try to give things for granted, saying that being different is kind of okay because everybody has something to offer. This is not true. At least everybody has something to offer, but what they have to offer is different. And if this is heavily, say, influenced by, of course, where you come from, for whichever political, territorial reasons, historically, well, you cannot unsee that. After all, we have stats, we have pretty good grasp if we just really want to depict correctly a people or another. And we have been told that those differences are not supposed to mean anything, and that's a disastrous path down the line. I mean, I think that merit truly does the thing, meaning that if you are capable, you are. The problem is that merit is being, let's say, at least standards as well are essentially sinking. So we're getting lots of people with no particular capacity as nationals or aliens that are supposed to do something for us, but they're evidently unqualified. And we are supposed to play along into thinking that every person has the same value. Well, where as a matter of fact, this is absolutely not true, because nobody has. And that's where the hierarchic traditional model comes from. It's good to balance the opportunity with the outcome, and that's what we all do. If it wasn't for the fact that the awareness of this is sinking, and so it's becoming ever less. It's being done ever less frequently and ever less in the first place, and so the situation is not positive really for everyone. And there are so many reasons why this happens that now we can't simply digress in. But now, in fact, I'm really going a bit off the tangent. We'll keep seeing this aspects and these things hopefully tomorrow. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.